Someone is madly in love with you, but this relationship is forbidden, and this means two things you must understand. Stop for a moment, breathe, because this message doesn't appear by chance. If someone just crossed your mind, it's not a coincidence. There are the invisible ones who remain active, and there is a person, perhaps someone present in your life, perhaps someone who appears in your thoughts without warning, who feels deeply connected to you. Not from the surface, not from the game or passing curiosity, but from an internal, intense, and silent place. They don't express it chaotically or dramatically. They live it with control, with containment in a way they never allowed themselves to feel before. And yet, this connection doesn't flow freely, not because emotion is lacking, but because something stands in the way. Circumstances, responsibilities, internal or external limits, turn this bond into something that shouldn't be. And that forbidden condition doesn't weaken it, it makes it more powerful. Here, the first meaning is revealed. When a relationship feels forbidden, it's rarely superficial. It's not born from emptiness or the need to fill a void. It arises from deep recognition. This person didn't decide to fall in love with you. It wasn't a conscious choice. It began as interest, then admiration, then trust, and without realizing it, you became someone impossible to get out of their mind. What makes this bond complex isn't the lack of love, but the timing, the context, the fear of losing what already exists. Perhaps there are previous commitments, perhaps family expectations, moral mandates, social structures, or promises made from another version of themselves. Perhaps this connection challenges everything they believed was right to desire. That's why they hold back. Here appears the first great truth. This person isn't fighting against you, they're fighting with themselves every day. They wake up with your image circling their mind and immediately remind themselves why they shouldn't think about you. They relive conversations, smile without meaning to, and then correct themselves internally. They fantasize about closeness, but shut down that thought because desiring you threatens the balance of the life they've built. That's why they stay silent, not because they don't feel, but because they feel too much. They don't act, because acting would mean facing consequences they don't yet dare to look at. They don't come closer because closeness would reveal truths they've been avoiding, even facing themselves. Silence in this case isn't emptiness, it's emotional saturation, it's containment, it's fear of opening a door they might not be able to close again. There's an internal law of the psyche that explains this. What is repressed doesn't dissolve, it intensifies. Each message they don't send, each impulse they restrain, each step they don't take, doesn't weaken the bond, it compresses it, and what's compressed doesn't disappear, it accumulates force. That's why you feel that strange tension between you, that sensation of presence, even in distance. That's why you think about him or her without apparent reason. That's why your emotions change inexplicably. There's something unfinished floating between you both. An energy that hasn't found an outlet. Unexpressed feelings don't die, they wait, and while they wait, they influence. Carl Jung explained that what we don't make conscious operates from the shadow and ends up directing our life as if it were destiny. Right now, much of what binds you inhabits there, in the unsaid, in the unadmitted, in the unresolved. And precisely because it hasn't been brought to light, it continues moving beneath the surface, shaping emotions, silences, and invisible encounters. This person keeps you in a place almost no one has access to. You appear in their thoughts when everything is silent, in those moments where there are no masks or roles to maintain. Outwardly, they may seem stable, coherent, self-possessed, but inside there's a constant dialogue. Move forward one step and back two, allow desire and then repress it. Not because you're not important, but precisely because you're too important. There's fear. Fear of disrupting lives, of breaking balances, of betraying principles that were once pillars. Fear of opening something they don't know how to close afterward. That internal tension is exhausting, and that's why the connection weighs sometimes. That's why it feels intense, even without contact. That's why distance doesn't relieve, it only postpones. When two internal worlds truly touch, something inevitably changes. There's already been a reaction between you, even if you haven't named it. Something in them shifted upon meeting you, and something in you reordered itself upon feeling them. It's not fantasy or idealization, it's transformation, and that's why the passage of time doesn't erase this bond. It's not sustained by habit or physical closeness, but by meaning. Here there are no power games or attempts to dominate, no hidden strategies or emotional manipulation. Precisely because of that, it's so disconcerting. It's an experience neither of you planned, and that now you don't know how to accommodate within the architecture of your current lives. Over time, one truth becomes evident. You're not a passing distraction, you're not a mistake along the way, you're not interchangeable. You're part of an internal process that has already begun to push them inward toward greater emotional clarity. And as that consciousness expands, the meaning of this impossible bond will slowly reveal itself, layer by layer, without hurry, until what follows is ready to show itself. And while that happens, there's something impossible to ignore. This connection doesn't work like a common attraction. It doesn't weaken with absence. It doesn't dissolve with rational explanations. It doesn't disappear just because it's uncomfortable. On the contrary, it accompanies you in silence. Even when you're busy, even when your attention seems to be elsewhere, this person returns to your mind effortlessly, not because you invoke them, but because there's something unfinished that keeps pulsing. And on the other side, the same thing happens. They can spend days appearing normal. They can seem absorbed by responsibilities, routines, commitments, but the mind always returns to what couldn't be closed. They remember how they felt understood without having to justify themselves. They remember the naturalness of dialogue, the sensation of recognition, that familiarity, difficult to explain. Moments that in theory shouldn't have meant so much, and that precisely because of that disturb them, because once someone sees you at that level, you can't go back. This is where many misinterpret forbidden bonds. They assume distance indicates lack of feeling, when in reality many times it signals the opposite. Distance doesn't always stem from disinterest. Sometimes it stems from excess. This person senses that if they come a little closer, they'll no longer be able to keep being who they were. They feel that on the other side of honesty, there's a point of no return, and they still don't feel prepared to dismantle a life they've built carefully, even though deep down it no longer fits them quite right. That's why they choose control instead of truth, known stability instead of uncertain authenticity. But that choice has a price. Nothing they repress vanishes. It reorganizes internally, appears as restlessness, as dispersion, as an emotional disconnection with those they should be present with. They begin to question bonds that once seemed solid. They ask themselves why something is missing, why answers that used to suffice no longer reach. And all of this happens because a part of their truth has awakened and can't go back to sleep. They may never pronounce your name out loud, but your energy becomes their internal measure. Without realizing it, they start comparing everything to you, not because they're searching, but because you represent a form of emotional truth they haven't yet allowed themselves to inhabit. That's why the bond feels incomplete. It's not just contained desire. It's the sensation of being on the edge of a profound change. And you know it too, even if you can't explain it in words. Since they appeared in your life, something in you silently reordered itself. Your limits adjusted. What you used to tolerate now weighs on you. What you desired became clearer. Connections that once seemed sufficient today feel hollow. You find yourself less willing to accept half-present presences, less patient with bonds without depth, more aware of what authentic resonance feels like. That clarity didn't come from nowhere, it was born from recognition. Here begins the second layer of meaning. This encounter isn't only about longing, it's about awakening. There are relationships that arrive to be shared in time, and others that arrive to awaken you to yourself. This belongs to the second type, not because it can't transform into something more, but because its initial function is interior. You met this person at a moment when something inside you was ready to be stirred. And they met you when, though they didn't say it, they were already questioning the life they were leading. That's why the attraction is so intense and so disconcerting at the same time. You're mirrors. You reflect parts of them that had been repressed. They reflect parts of you that were waiting to be seen. This type of connection doesn't obey usual timelines. It's not in a hurry. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand immediate definitions. It works in silence from within, reconfiguring values, priorities, and emotional awareness. That's why even the absence between you feels charged. Something continues moving beneath the surface. Perhaps you wonder why letting go seems impossible. Because reason doesn't bring relief. Because repeating to yourself that nothing can happen doesn't free you. It's because this bond isn't sustained in fantasy, but in a truth that hasn't yet been lived, and truth, once felt, can't be erased. You're not clinging to a person, you're clinging to an experience of emotional clarity that transformed you, and the same thing is happening to them. This doesn't mean you should wait. It doesn't mean stopping your life or sacrificing your present for an uncertain possibility. It means understanding what this connection came to show you. It's revealing to you the real depth of your capacity to feel. It's showing you the type of bond that nourishes instead of wearing down. It's reminding you that authentic love exists beyond convenience and fear. And whether they recognize it or not, it's doing the same in them. What comes next can't be forced. It doesn't respond to desire, strategic silence, or pursuit. This type of bond only unfolds when honesty becomes stronger than fear. Until then, it inhabits an intermediate space. It hasn't left, but it's not completely present either. It lives in thought, lives in emotion, lives in those quiet moments where truth whispers instead of shouts. With the passage of time, the tension between who they are and who they're starting to become will continue to grow. And the same happens with you. Eventually, something will have to transform. The consciousness that awakens can't go back to sleep forever. And when change arrives, it won't be born from longing, but from readiness. That readiness doesn't arrive dramatically. It doesn't announce itself with impulsive declarations or grand gestures. It manifests as growing discomfort, as the persistent sensation that something internal no longer fits with the life being lived. In them, it usually appears as a subtle crack. The roles they once performed with ease begin to feel heavy. The obligations they once accepted without question now become restrictive. Emotional routines empty out, even though from the outside everything seems in order. And you're not the cause of that fracture, you're the contrast that made it visible. You didn't alter their life, you illuminated what was already misaligned. And that's why this connection is disturbing to them. Not because it threatens stability, but because it threatens the illusion. Illusions are comfortable, truth is not. Truth demands responsibility, demands courage, demands that a person look directly at what they feel and decide if they're willing to live according to it. And many people aren't prepared to make that decision when the feeling first appears. So they postpone, rationalize. They tell themselves it's just a phase, that it's a projection, that it will disappear if they ignore it long enough. But what awakens doesn't go back to sleep so easily. Connections that touch the deep don't disappear through abandonment. When they can't be expressed, they become internal tension. That's why you perceive cycles of closeness and withdrawal, moments when they seem emotionally available and without warning, close off again. That's why there are moments when you feel intensely connected without any contact existing. That oscillation doesn't speak of doubt toward you. It speaks of an internal battle that hasn't yet been resolved. They find themselves at the threshold between the identity they've sustained for years and the person they're beginning to become, and you embody that point of passage. From your place, something equally significant is occurring. You're developing discernment. You're learning to differentiate between intensity and coherence, between attraction and real alignment, between momentary attention and deep recognition. This connection didn't arrive to destabilize you, but to refine you. Perhaps you notice you no longer seek superficial affection as before, that it's less attractive to you to pursue validation, that you're not willing to reduce yourself to fit into others' comfort. That's not coincidence, it's evolution. This bond is teaching you self-respect without speeches, showing you what it feels like to be seen emotionally, even though it remained incomplete. And once you know that sensation, you can't ignore it anymore. That's why this bond feels sacred, not because it's perfect, easy, or guaranteed, but because it's meaningful beyond the outcome. Whether it materializes into something tangible or not, it has already fulfilled part of its function. It has expanded your emotional consciousness. It has refined your intuition. It has clarified what you value in love and connection. And in them, it has provoked a similar movement. That's why neither of you can simply erase it. It's interwoven in the process of who you're becoming. Perhaps you wonder why it appeared at such an inconvenient moment, why it arrived when it couldn't be lived easily. But timing doesn't always speak of punishment, it often speaks of preparation. Sometimes two people meet, not to unite immediately, but to transform separately. Without that internal work, even the most intense bond can crumble under the weight of unexplored fears and unresolved patterns. Right now, both of you are being asked something deeper than desire. You're being invited to look at the truth. For them, the question is whether they're willing to live with honesty, even when honesty implies consequences. For you, the question is whether you're willing to honor yourself, even when waiting is tempting. That's why patience here doesn't stem from expectation, but from trust in yourself. You're not destined to stop your life or stay suspended in longing. You're destined to keep growing, choosing, living. And if this connection is to evolve, it will do so when both of you can meet without hiding, without reservations, without internal divisions. And if it doesn't transform into a shared path, its impact will remain because it has already readjusted your internal compass. That's not loss, it's initiation. Many people go through life without ever experiencing a bond that truly awakens them. They remain in safe but empty relationships, choosing comfort instead of authenticity. You have touched something real enough to question patterns, expose fears, and demand growth. That's what distinguishes this experience. Over time, clarity will continue emerging, not by force or passive waiting, but through lived honesty. People either rise to the truth they feel or retreat to what's familiar and safe. Both paths reveal answers, and you won't need to pursue them. They'll manifest in behaviors, decisions, and in the passage of time. Meanwhile, trust in what this bond has already delivered to you. Not longing, but consciousness. And consciousness, once awakened, doesn't leave you intact. As it deepens, something subtle but irreversible occurs. You stop trying to define the connection. You stop demanding explanations, and you begin to listen to what's awakening within you. This is where power silently returns to your hands, because the true risk of a forbidden connection isn't desire, it's losing yourself, trying to understand it. And that's no longer happening. You begin to notice how centered you feel when you choose yourself, how calm returns when you stop looking for signs, how clarity grows when you abandon the interpretation of silence and begin to honor your own inner stability. That change is more important than you imagine, because if before this connection dragged you inward with intensity, now it's revealing something even deeper to you, sovereignty over yourself. You're understanding something essential. An authentic connection doesn't demand that you abandon yourself. Real love doesn't leave you suspended in ambiguity, and depth doesn't need suffering as proof. This understanding is key regardless of whether the path with this person continues or not. While you integrate this truth consciously, on the other side, the tension keeps accumulating because they're still processing it internally. Now they perceive with greater clarity the contrast between who they are in the world and who they feel like when thinking about you, between the version that complies, sustains, and responds to what's expected, and the version that feels alive when connecting with their emotional truth. That contrast can't be ignored forever. People can avoid conversations, decisions, uncomfortable confrontations, but they can't flee from themselves indefinitely. At some point, something cracks, not dramatically or explosively, but silently. They start asking themselves questions they used to avoid. Why do I feel restless? Why doesn't the life I chose fully satisfy me anymore? Why is there a persistent sensation of incompleteness? And although they never pronounce your name, your presence resonates within those questions. This is where many forbidden connections find their turning point, because when consciousness awakens, it demands a choice, and choosing requires courage. Some people rise to that threshold. They choose honesty over appearance, truth over comfort, growth over fear. Others retreat, reinforce routines, harden defenses, convince themselves that numbness is stability. Both paths reveal the truth, not through words, but through actions. And here is where your anchoring in yourself becomes fundamental. It's not your role to save anyone from their fear. It's not your responsibility to wait for another person's awakening. It's not your task to carry an emotional weight that isn't being shared. Your responsibility is to remain aligned with your own truth. You learn to stay open without remaining available for confusion, to be compassionate without betraying your needs, to be receptive without reducing your boundaries. It's a subtle balance, but today you're capable of sustaining it because this experience has already transformed you. You no longer idealize potential while sacrificing reality. You no longer confuse intensity with emotional readiness. You no longer interpret silence as mystery. You see with greater clarity, and clarity is a form of freedom. That's why, paradoxically, the bond no longer consumes you as before. It remains significant, but it no longer possesses you. It informs you. You can feel it without losing yourself, recognize it without building your life around it, hold it without clinging. That's emotional maturity. And that maturity is what allows the next stage to reveal itself, whatever its form may be. If this connection is destined to become a lived, shared, real love, it will require something very concrete. Mutual courage, not longing, not chemistry, not shared history. Courage, the courage to speak with clarity, to transform what's no longer aligned, to take responsibility for one's own truth. Without that, even the deepest bond remains suspended, powerful, but incomplete. And you no longer fear that incompleteness because you understand that meaning doesn't depend on the outcome, that transformation doesn't require permanence, that some connections arrive as chapters, not as endings. As Jung pointed out, The greatest privilege of a life is to become who you really are. This encounter has brought both of you closer to that privilege. Whether they take or don't take, the complete step toward that truth is their process. That you continue moving forward with integrity is yours, and you're choosing to move forward. You're choosing presence, growth, a life guided by truth and not by fear. That doesn't imply closing your heart, but opening it with discernment. You remain available for a love that meets you completely, for a bond that doesn't require secrets, for an intimacy that doesn't live fragmented. And here emerges the silent truth. When you stop pursuing clarity, clarity appears. When you stop waiting for answers, answers manifest in facts. When you release attachment to potential, reality reveals itself. You're no longer trapped in the intermediate space. You're firmly standing within yourself. From there, what happens next doesn't diminish you. Either someone meets you from truth, or life frees you towards something more aligned. In neither case is there loss. There is becoming. This isn't a loud ending, it's an internal closure, because some connections don't conclude with certainties, but with understanding. And in that understanding, you recognize that this bond was never destined to retain you in longing. It was destined to refine you, to teach you the difference between attachment and alignment, between desire and destiny, between intensity that wears down and depth that strengthens. And perhaps now you can see something more. What made this connection forbidden wasn't just the external circumstance, it was the distance between consciousness and readiness. Two souls recognized each other, but they weren't yet ready to meet in life. And that difference matters, because soul recognition is powerful, but by itself it's not enough. Life doesn't wait. It demands integration, decision, and action. And this is where many people are mistaken. They believe an intense connection must be pursued at any cost. But intensity without roots can transform into suffering, and meaning without embodiment becomes longing. You're no longer trapped in that confusion. You've understood that genuine love doesn't live only in fantasy. It doesn't survive in silence, nor is it sustained only in containment. Real love requires presence, coherence, responsibility. And if those elements aren't present, it doesn't invalidate the connection, it simply redefines its function. Some relationships aren't destinations, they're bridges. They transport you from who you were to who you're becoming. This connection has already fulfilled its purpose. It showed you what it feels like to be emotionally recognized. It awakened your capacity for depth, sharpened your intuition, elevated your standards, and made you confront patience, discernment, and self-respect all at the same time. That's not a minor gift. You no longer need to seek explanations. You don't need to interpret every silence or assign meaning to every distance. The essential has already been revealed. This connection arrived to awaken your truth, not to confuse you, not to limit you, not to keep you waiting. It arrived to show you what's possible when two people meet beyond masks. What happens next is no longer under your control. If they choose courage, you'll recognize it. Not by signs, not by longing, but by actions. And if they don't, you'll also know it. Because inaction also speaks, and you're already at peace with that. You've learned that waiting only hurts if it stems from fear. Releasing expectation is liberating when it springs from trust in yourself. You're no longer suspended between doubt and hope. You're firmly rooted in your center. And that rooting transforms everything. From here, you don't close your heart. You open it with wisdom. You allow love to come to you without secrets, without fragmentation, without renouncing your being. Now you're available for a connection that meets you fully, not only in thought, but in real presence, not only in possibility, but in conscious choice. And here the final truth is revealed. If this bond ever materializes tangibly, it won't be confusing. It won't reside in silence. It will live in the clarity of decision. It will ask you to walk together head-on, without conditions that make you disappear. Until that moment, you lack nothing. You're complete. As Jung said, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. This relationship didn't define you. Your response to it did. You chose growth over obsession, consciousness over illusion, integrity over abandoning yourself. That choice is worth more than any outcome, because from now on, you don't pursue depth, you recognize it. You don't cling to meaning, you embody it. You no longer fear endings that don't seem like beginnings, because you understand that some closures are initiations, and whether they take the complete step toward truth, or this bond remains as a silent chapter that transformed you, you move forward stronger, clearer, more aligned. You no longer ask what it means. You're living the answer, and the answer is simple. You're becoming someone who chooses a love capable of sustaining itself in reality. Someone who honors depth without renouncing themselves, who trusts in the moment without surrendering their power. This connection didn't come to break you, it came to reveal you. And now you carry that revelation with you, calm, complete, whole.